Looking back at The Walking Dead Season 1, a season which now premiered over a decade ago, hits me with a wave of nostalgia. Not only is it cool to see the beginning of a series that would go on for many more years, spawn many different TV shows, and still have at least a bit of success to this very day, but it's also strange to see just how different the show was back in 2010. The zombie genre in 2010 was just beginning to see the height of its popularity. There were popular video games like Left 4 Dead, Call of Duty Black Ops Zombies, the first Black Ops that is, Dead Rising 2, among many others, but there were also a few movies in the early 2000s that found success, like 28 Days Later, Dawn of the Dead, the first few Resident Evil movies, but when the first episode of The Walking Dead hit our screens on Halloween night of 2010, the zombie genre, for better or worse, changed forever. Now, the show isn't solely responsible for the rise of the zombie genre that would follow in the years to come, but it's certainly a big springboard for why it got so popular, and also why it got so oversaturated. But in this video, I'm going to be looking back at the first season, how it holds up, the impact that it made on the genre, and how different the show was back then compared to how it is now. And with there being 11 seasons of the show, I'm going to be doing a video like this for each and every season for each of the 11 months of the year. Wait, that doesn't sound right. Well, whatever, there's going to be a new video for each month discussing and dissecting a new season. So if you like what you see in this video, go ahead and subscribe and watch the other videos, and who knows, maybe some of my other videos as well. So let's journey back to a time when The Walking Dead wasn't a household name, didn't have 6 different spin-off shows, and it was about a group of people fighting to survive in the zombie apocalypse. All that started in The Walking Dead Season 1. Given as how there's only 6 episodes to this season, I'm going to go over each of them one by one. I won't be doing this in the later seasons, just highlighting certain episodes and events that happen, but since this is only 6 episodes, and this is the one that started it all, I'll go by episode, and that starts us with Season 1, Episode 1, Days Gone By. Now, there's not much I can say about Days Gone By that hasn't been said already by a lot of people. This episode is up there with, I'd say, like Lost, as having the best pilot episode of all time, and everything else can maybe come close, but it's not as good. By itself, this episode works almost like it's the first movie of a series, and everything that we see is so carefully crafted and written to complete perfection. We get to see everything unfold in front of us, and we are told very little, which is one of the #1 rules about screenwriting: show, don't tell. We see how good of friends Rick and Shane are, we see just how insane the world has become, we see that Shane and this woman are together, and then we see, oh, that's Rick's wife. There's so little exposition and explanation in this episode. Really, the only bits of this is when Rick and Morgan are talking over dinner, and them talking about the world, what's happened, and all of that is necessary to the plot. There can be good exposition and bad exposition, and this moment right here is an example of good exposition. Rick has no idea what the hell is going on. There's this excellent moment when he gets back to his house and he's literally talking to himself saying, is this even real? Am I here right now? And I think that's such a great scene, and it's a quick scene, because if anybody else was in Rick's situation right here, you'd probably be thinking the exact same thing. So when Morgan is explaining what's happened to Rick, he calls the dead walkers. This is the audience learning things for the first time along with our protagonists, and that is usually a good sign of exposition. Bad exposition is when characters are explaining a situation or something that the audience should already know about, but the dialogue is reminding you of what they're talking about.
The clean slate, where you type in someone's name, date of birth, in a few minutes they're gone.
I mean, you might as well just look at the camera and speak directly to the audience at that point. I think one of the reasons why this episode stands out in particular is the character of Morgan. Thinking about Morgan's role in the greater Walking Dead universe now, it's crazy to see that the popularity of this character stemmed from this episode. Morgan wouldn't become a season regular until years later in the show, making an appearance in only one other episode if you don't count the post-credit scenes or the season 5 finale, yet people became so attached to the character of Morgan and they wanted him back. That's because Morgan had his own character arc in this single episode, and he was written to be such a likable dude. There's plenty of examples of great characters that only appear in a single episode in The Walking Dead, and while Morgan doesn't belong in that category anymore, there was a time that he did, and he was far and away the best character during that time that he was in the category. This episode does what all pilots should do, and that's setup. This episode sets up the characters, their relation to each other, their different goals and motivations, and leaves us on a scene that we want to see the resolution of. This is a perfect episode of not only The Walking Dead, but television in general, and it's easy to see why The Walking Dead became such a hit after this episode premiered. So episode 2, titled Guts, introduces us to a whole new cast of characters who would go on to become the beginning of our group of survivors. Glenn is immediately the favorite of these characters. He's the one who saves Rick, and he's incredibly likable and is somebody who the audience can see themselves as. The everyday pizza delivery boy, kinda nerdy, and still sees the bright side of life despite the situation they're in. There's also characters like Andrea, T-Dog, and Merle that would go on to have a varying amount of screen time and importance. But I think what this episode does so well is highlight the survival aspect of the show. They're in a sticky situation with the walkers surrounding them, and you can really feel that tension and that struggle. You feel so captivated in their survival, and even after watching this show many times over and knowing that they're gonna get out, it doesn't make this episode feel any less tense. It's also funny because our characters get in situations like this countless times over the seasons, but usually they can just run away or find an alternate method of escape. Rarely is there a scene that has as great of tension and buildup as this one does. Now, there's a number of reasons for that. The show couldn't sustain the amount of tension for every single Walker Horde encounter, so they differentiated them from here on out, but it doesn't take anything away from this episode and this escape. In episode 3, Tell It to the Frogs, we shift away from the survival horror of the show into more of the character drama portion that the show would later go on to fully embrace. But it's also not like this came out of nowhere. The first 2 episodes built up this reunion between Rick and his family, and also the drama that would be sure to come of it. We get several reunions early on in the episode. This group that we see Shane and Rick's family have also been a part of is the same group that the characters from episode 2 are a part of. So Andrea sees her sister, Morales sees his family, and of course, the reunion of Rick and his family. This is such an excellent scene and a great payoff in just 3 episodes, which goes to show how great these characters are written because we truly care about the things going on in their lives outside of just killing zombies. But now that we're in this camp, we get to see more of the dynamics and the characters that we've briefly seen already. Shane is the one who's more or less in charge of everything, Dale is the old wise mentor, Carol is the helpless and abused housewife, and we also meet this new guy, Daryl Dixon. And this guy seems like he's gonna be a problem. I hope he's not around for too long. Daryl's introductory scene is actually really great. He wonders where Merle is, Shane steps in to tell Daryl that he's not around, but then Rick steps up because he thinks that it's his responsibility to tell him. This is already changing the dynamic of the group, because while Shane steps in because he thinks he has to, Rick steps up because it's the right thing to do. So with Rick entering this group, the whole dynamic shifts. He brings an old world mindset into the new world, and this gives a lot of people in the group some newfound hope. And very quickly, this group starts to view Rick as the potential new leader. Leaving Merle behind takes a toll on his conscience, and even though he's just got back to his wife and kids, he takes on the responsibility of somebody else's life, even if it means risking his own life. The others, while they may not even realize it at the time, eventually come to learn that this is somebody that they want looking out for them. This whole exchange of power works out great for some people, but not as well for one person in particular, and that's Shane. The dynamic between Rick and Shane is really at the forefront of the story for the remainder of the season and the entire next season, and there's definitely a reason for that. Andrew Lincoln and John Bernthal play off of each other so well and bring so many different levels to each and every scene that they're in. This was also the start of an aspect that I feel is super underrated in the show, and that's the differing opinions of audience members. As this series goes on, this becomes way more relevant, but especially during this episode and maybe the following one, you feel a little bad for Shane. On one hand, you have some people who think that Shane is a rat bastard for getting with his friend's wife when he was still alive, and on the other hand, people saw Shane as a man who was doing everything he could for his best friend's family and happened to fall in love with Lori, but he had every indication that Rick was dead, and he was even being a good, surrogate father for Carl. These difference in opinions between the audience was my absolute favorite part of watching this show as it went on. Particularly in the seasons 5 to 6 era, almost every episode gave the audience something to debate, and I remember being part of those conversations online, even having them with my friends and family. What was right, what wasn't, and that all really stems from the character drama that was presented in this episode. I also have to highlight the writing, not only of this episode, but of the season in general. Whether it be quick and witty remarks, talks of survival between the characters, or even some of the deep and impactful conversations, each and every scene leaves you on the edge of your seat to hear what happens next, laugh at a funny remark, or lead you to care more about the character speaking. This is certainly something that the show loses as the seasons go on and more characters are introduced. They just either weren't as impactful as the characters that were introduced here, or the writing for them wasn't as captivating. And of course, it's always great to see Shane beat the ever-living crap out of Ed. Regardless of everybody's opinions on Shane, we can all root for him here in this moment. In episode 4, Vatos, we pick up right where we left off in the last episode, showing the effects of the apocalypse and how it impacts different people back at the camp, and the group in Atlanta trying to find Merle and get the guns back when they run into trouble with another group of survivors. Given what the show becomes, the storylines in this episode feel very restricted and almost a little bland, but once again, when you combine the tension of the mission and the excellent dialogue between the characters, this apparently bland synopsis is elevated to one of the best episodes of the season. We also get to see the first group outside of the one that we've seen, and just how far society has dissolved. This episode is, of course, a glimpse into the future of the show, where people would become the main threat and zombies would be secondary. The dilemma presented in this episode is a good one. The Vatos want the guns to protect their own, but so does Rick, and it seems that these people aren't the greatest at first glance, threatening to kill Glenn, but then we find out it's the exact opposite. These people are actually just keeping a retirement home up and running, so they eventually see eye to eye. On one hand, this misdirection is really great and makes sense that there would still be some good people left in the world to care for others, but on the other hand, I feel like this card was played too early. Getting to see a nastier side of the world when it comes to humans would be a great introduction to what the world is like now, and we're told that there's been some plunderers that the Vatos have run into, but so far, every single human that we've seen is basically nothing but a good person, maybe outside of Merle. I almost wish that this misdirection of an enemy group of people was saved for later, but as it stands, this is still a great episode. Back at the camp, we also see that being in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by woods, is actually not a great place to hold out, and the group now has to find a new home after an attack that leads to the end of a lot of people's lives. This is also the first time that we see the group full-on fight off a group of walkers. They've only really run away from them before this, and this is also, of course, a trend that would continue in the years to come. In episode 5, Wildfire, it shows us the aftermath of what the attack does to our group mentally, the full change in group dynamics between Rick and Shane, and the conversations regarding where they should go next. This is another episode that highly focuses on the group dynamic and the different personalities clashing in the zombie apocalypse. Things like Rick suggesting that they go to the CDC to get the cure, Glenn yelling that they bury their dead, they don't burn them, and Jim trying to hide his bite from everybody, hoping that it'll just get better. These different conversations and even storylines in the show are clear signs that this is the first season of the show. Bites don't just get better, not everybody is able to get buried, and there is no cure. This episode is really focused on furthering the development of our characters, see how this adversity affects each and every member of the group. People like Andrea absolutely crumble at the death of a loved one, while Carol is not too deeply affected. This is also the first ever scene between Daryl and Carol, which turns out to be a very important friendship that's continued on into present day. In this episode, the group fully embraces Rick's ideology, and the torch is unwillingly passed from Shane to Rick. Shane wanted to go to the military base, Fort Benning, away from the city in hopes that a military base would still have all the supplies that they need, whereas Rick wants to go to the CDC in hopes that it's still up and running and they can get a cure for Jim. I think these two choices perfectly reflect the characters of Rick and Shane at this time in the show. Shane is a realist. He wants to do what's best for them right now, in that moment, the people who are still alive, and go to a place that's proven to have more weapons and fortification. Rick is an idealist. He still has hope that maybe the CDC is up and running and they'll have a cure for this thing, even if that's just a long shot. Ultimately, hope wins out, even with some skepticism from Lori, who maybe thinks that Shane is correct, and this is also set up for how big of a wrench Lori throws in between Rick and Shane in season 2. But the group goes to the CDC, drops off Jim on the way, and we meet Dr. Edwin Jenner. In the season finale, TS19, we see the group enter the CDC, and I've done a more in-depth analysis of this episode in the past, so if you want to hear my full thoughts on that, I'll leave the link up for it in the corner right now, but I have a lot of mixed feelings on this episode. For one, as a season closer, I do think that it was the right direction to go in. The CDC seems like the ultimate best place to be, especially with how it's depicted in this episode, but as an episode that ends a season of a show that would go on for over a decade, I feel like this was too early. Finding out more about the virus, that there's no cure, that there really is no hope in the world, it all seems like territory that could have and should have been covered in later seasons. But as I say that, hindsight is 2020. They had no idea how big of a hit that the show would be, that it would last as long as it has, and I think that the show got progressively better over the next few seasons, so changing all of seasons 2 to 6 just so that way they can go and visit the CDC is not really something that I would have wanted. But later than that, seasons 9 to 11 could have been interesting if it wasn't an avenue that they already visited. On its own, this is still a great episode. What sticks out to me here is the structure of the episode. The first half of the episode is all about bringing this place up. We walk in, see how great this place potentially is. They all have hot showers, a nice dinner with lots of wine. Even Glenn with a hangover here is better than being out in the world. But at around the halfway mark, we learn more about the virus, test subject 19 being Jenner's wife, and the second half of the episode is all about bringing this place down. The electricity runs out, they're out of fuel, and ultimately leads to the CDC literally exploding and leaving our group on the road. It's a real shame too, because if not for this doomsday counter and fuel being a finite resource, the CDC would absolutely be the best place to live in the zombie apocalypse. The season introduces us to our group, establishes the world and the rules that it follows, and sets up a lot of plot lines for the future of the show. If this series had not done well and this was the only season we got, it wouldn't even be close to a complete story. I mean, I still don't think we have a complete story even all these years later, but with the storylines introduced here, we wouldn't have gotten any semblance of conclusion. So now I think is a good time to talk about a few of the things in this season that don't really hold up when looking at it in retrospect. For one, I obviously have to talk about the zombies themselves. These walkers aren't even really walkers at all. They have the capability to run at you, to try and climb ladders, and even some of their memory. After the first episode and the first season in general, the walkers wouldn't do anything like this until the back half of season 11, and even that was just to try and call back to the zombies from the first season. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. I know and understand that completely, but it's still just such a strange choice to have the zombies' behavior change so drastically when it was a big focus in these early episodes. I also find it strange that there's so many different names for the zombies, yet both Morgan and the Atlanta Survivor Camp just so happen to call them walkers. Maybe that was their official name when the news first broke out, but I find it awfully coincidental if it wasn't. Maybe that's a bit nitpicky, but there's also a lot of evidence that the show was setting things up that eventually never happened. There's a scene with Rick and Andrea in the store, and they're kind of doing a bit of flirting, possibly setting them up to eventually get together like in the comics, and this scene would have been pointed to as the first initial setup for it, but this, of course, never came to fruition. But there's also an equal amount of setup that eventually did get payoffs. All the Rick vs. Shane stuff, what Dr. Jenner whispered to Rick, Merle escaping Atlanta, all of this stuff does get brought back up, so while there were some training wheels on for this first season, when the wheels came off, a lot of the stuff that was highlighted did come back for the future. This season, and this show in general, is a character drama disguised as a zombie survival show. It's always been about the characters and how they navigate this world, not about getting food to survive or finding a good base to hold out in. All that stuff is secondary when it comes to The Walking Dead. There might be an episode 2 about getting food, or it might be a plot point leading to some other storyline, but it's never been the main focus, which I feel like turns some people off when it becomes the soap opera with zombies, as some people so lovingly refer to it as. While the season had a higher emphasis on the survival against the zombies, it's still about the characters. Seeing Rick say things like, "We don't kill the living," or Carol apologize to Ed after he's the one who hit her, and Daryl being really antagonistic towards Rick Grimes, all goes to show where these characters start, and eventually where they end up and who they end up becoming. That being said, the season did have an emphasis on two things that the show would later lose: survival and horror. The survival aspects come from the conversations of where to go for safety, traversing the world, and getting rid of the walkers, and the horror, of course, comes from the walkers themselves. While the show would never completely shed these aspects from the story, they wouldn't be nearly as relevant. But that's also not a bad thing. People eventually grew tired of the constant moving from place to place and the cheap jump scares from the walkers, so the show needed to grow in order to maintain its audience. So the show did grow, in some areas better than others, and that leads us to season 2. The first season of The Walking Dead does just about everything right upon first viewing, but in retrospect, it does have some flaws. So because of that, it's hard to give this season a rating. When I first saw it, it was a pure 10 out of 10, but as this video is a retrospective, I have to take the nostalgia out of it, so I'm gonna go with the final score of a 9 out of 10. But that's a wrap on season 1. Again, I'm gonna be doing these each month, covering a new season and some other Walking Dead videos mixed in here and there with my other stuff. So if you enjoyed this video and want to hear my thoughts on the rest of the series, make sure you subscribe for more content like this, and like the video so I'll know to continue the series. If you do, then I'll see you all in the next one.
Yeah.